Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food. Oh my. We already looked at the introduction, scope, and style of the study, and now we're in this first section which covers 14 verse 1, and it really kind of picks up also some information from 14 verse 2. But who are the weak in faith? I think it's no secret that most Christian commentaries would label the strong in faith to be Christians, both Jews and Gentiles, but definitely Christians as strong. In fact, Paul labels himself as among the strong in chapter 15, verse 1. So we know without a doubt that the strong are Christians. But who are the weak? There are some various candidates. Could be Jews, could be Gentiles, could be believers, could be unbelievers. Most are of the opinion that they are Jewish believers who are still holding on to some semblance of the Torah, and that's what makes them weak, is their opinion that they should be keeping the Torah. But being a Messianic Jew myself, I take umbrage with that particular view. Kind of rubs me the wrong way that I should be counted as weak simply because I'm still a Torah observant Jew even after coming to faith in Messiah. So we're challenging that perspective not simply because I don't like the way it impacts me, but because it seems to run counter to some of the other internal evidence obtained from the chapter as a whole, and as well as from the book as a whole, and from the Bible as a whole. So let's jump now down into the study and pick up where we left off. We already talked about this little section, looking at some of the Greek behind some of the words that we see. What is the Greek of this phrase, to be weak? How does that impact us? Go back and listen to last week's study if you aren't certain, and you want to listen to it. You can go to iTunes and listen to it, or better yet, the easiest way to interact with the study, go to my website, tatesaytorah.com. Click on the link that says Live Internet Studies at the very, very top, right from the homepage, and scroll down to the Live Internet Studies page. And as you keep scrolling past the information about the study and the Skype details, you'll notice that there is a heading for a section for current ongoing Live Internet Studies media. And that's where I'm posting links to not only the latest video, which last week was episode 81, this is episode 82. But also, if you scroll past the video section, which you can play and watch right on my own website, you don't even have to leave my website to watch my videos. But if you keep scrolling down, there are links to the MP3 audio file, which has been uploaded to iTunes and my podcast channel. And you can see it's an hour long for the full study, broken into episode, the segment 1 and segment 2. You can download the file, or you can actually click the little player, and the player will just fire up on your browser or your mobile device or whatever you got. And you can just listen to the audio there, okay? So let's go back to the study. So that's last week's. If you want to look at that, scroll down now with me, and let's begin to further examine this section where I compare and contrast perhaps 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 with Romans 14. And the section is called that, right? 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 versus Romans 14. I'll just tell you right up front, I don't believe that the two groups that Paul was writing to, one at the church of Corinth and one at the church in Rome, I don't believe they were identical to one another. They had some similarities, to be sure. And we have Paul writing to Rome from within Corinth right around the same time, maybe in the mid-50s of his era, 50 AD or so. Before he traveled to Rome, he's writing this letter to Rome, and he's actually in Corinth, perhaps at the home of Gaius, his friend, and or Gaius, however you pronounce his name, Gaius. So Paul is probably has the same concepts on his mind. Maybe he's penning the letter to Corinthians and the letter to Rome right around the same time. They're both dated by most experts around the mid-50s, maybe even as late as this 57 or something around there. But for both letters, so it's understandable and feasible that there's going to be some overlap. The subject matters that Paul's dealing with, but I believe as a whole that the two people groups are different from one another, and for some very important reasons we'll see as we later on. So I read this paragraph here last week where we're going to be looking at a quote from Tom Martinsik, I believe I'm saying his name right, of Elia.com, and his opinion is worth looking at. He's of the opinion, I'll just tell you right up front, he's of the opinion that the weak and the strong of Romans 14 are the same weak and strong of 1 Corinthians 8 and 10. I disagree with his position there, but I do agree that there are strong similarities between the two groups, so strong that Paul has to write letters that contain similar verbiage between the two letters. So let's look at this for our study tonight. So starting right here, this is Mr. Martinsik of Elia.com. His opinion is, so who is the one who is weak in faith? He says, in the 8th chapter of 1 Corinthians, we read about a situation where they were dealing with weak brethren in relation to food as well. And then he's got a lengthy citation from 1 Corinthians 8, 10, 13. And I redacted the parts that contain the scriptural quotes so as not to make my own commentary too long. You can go back and read those verses on your own. All right. Mr. Martinsik continues. The subject matter of 1 Corinthians 8 is whether or not it is appropriate to eat food that was offered to idols. And for that, I firmly agree. Go back and read 1 Corinthians 8 and you'll find that, the very first verse. Now concerning food offered to idols, right? Mr. Martinsik continues. The weak brother was one who had not yet overcome the temptation to worship idols, likely a Gentile brother, and as we're going to see here from the verse that's quoted. Let's look at these verses in context, and then we've got another very lengthy quote from 1 Corinthians 8, 1 through 13. Again, Mr. Martinsik recommends that if you didn't read the above chapter, please go back and read it fully. I also recommend that you go back and read the passage on your own. Let's continue in my own commentary, though. Notice that the strong brother is one who has knowledge that an idol is nothing, whereas a weak brother is still being faced with temptations that the idol might actually be something deserving of honor or worship. Again, in the Martinsik is trying to suggest that the two people being spoken to in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 are weak Christians and strong Christians, but the key factor is they're both Christians. Now, perhaps one is a Gentile, one's a Jew. He doesn't say right up front. I get the impression from reading from the bulk of his commentary in context, and comparing that to standard Christian theology, that the weak and the strong brother are both essentially Gentile Christians. They're both Gentile Christians. Gentiles with a background in paganism is the point that's being made. So, Martinsik continues, the advice Paul gives in this situation is identical to the advice he gives in Romans 14. And I do agree that there is advice that is so similar, it uses a similar language, the same thought process that Paul must have had in mind as he's penning the letters. Who knows if he didn't write them in both, it's very, close proximity to one another, we're not sure. Martinsik continues, namely that while an idol is nothing, we should not do anything to cause another person to stumble. And then he challenges us to consider the parallels here. And yes, I want to consider these parallels. We got Romans 14:15, which reads, yet if your brother is grieved because of your food, you're no longer walking in love. Do not destroy with your food, Paul says, the one for whom Christ died. So notice the instruction to the strong about grieving the weaker brother because of food, and how that it is this brother for whom Messiah died. And now compare that to the similar verbiage in 1 Corinthians 8, 11, and 12, where we read, and Paul says, and because of your knowledge, right, talking about the knowledge of food offered to idols, shall the weak brother perish. Right? In Romans, the weak brother is grieved and perhaps destroyed. And in 1 Corinthians, the weak brother perishes. And who is this brother, this weak brother in 1 Corinthians 8:11? He's the one for whom Messiah died. Yeah, the same person that's mentioned, or the same verbiage that's mentioned in Romans 14:15. And then in verse 12 of 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, but when you thus sin against the brethren, right, the grieving that's mentioned in Romans, when you sin against the brethren and wound their weak conscience, again, the grieving, then you sin against the Messiah. So we see some definite parallels between the two chapters, and I highly recommend studying them together. And if you're of the opinion that they are the same types of people groups in both passages, where we have where the context of Romans 14 is food offered to idols, just like the 1 Corinthians 8 passage, then if that's your opinion, I'm fine with that. Like I said, I could be wrong where they're not the exact same, but nevertheless, there's enough verbiage that overlaps between the two that we can make that strong a plausible opinion. So that's fine. And then we have some more verbiage that Martinsik brings to our attention. If we look at Romans 14:21, Paul says, it is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine nor do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. And then we can compare that with 1 Corinthians 8:13, where Paul says, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, notice we have the stumbling in Romans 14:21 and the stumbling of this weaker brother in 1 Corinthians 8. Paul says, therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, Same context. I will never again eat meat lest I make my brother stumble. And again, never again eating meat is parallel to, it is neither good to eat meat or drink wine. So we have this, the parallels are just extremely striking. And so it's no wonder why many commentators like Mr. Martinsick would draw the conclusion that Paul is addressing two different communities separated, and they're definitely in different parts of the world, one being in Rome and one being in Corinth, but the situations facing the two communities where we had weak and strong Christians that were judging one another based on their persuasion over food and things like that is what Paul addressing. Again, I disagree with the final conclusion there, but we'll find out more about what I believe as we go on through my own commentary. So Martinsick continues. I think this is his words. Yeah, he says, so we have almost identical statements coming out of both chapters. The verses in 1 Corinthians are more descriptive in that he is specifically speaking of food offered to idols, which is true. And Romans 14, by comparison, Martinsick notices, is a bit more vague and open to interpretation, which is also somewhat true if you go back and read the passages. So I don't seriously disagree with what Martinsick says there concerning the two passages. Just my final analysis is differing. And who's to say which one of us is right? I'm not trying to judge him and say my opinion is right. You got to listen to Ariel. No. I'm simply just offering a different take on the passages so that we can do our research a little more thoroughly. Let's conclude with this final paragraph from Martinsick. He says, since Romans 14:22 is exactly what was taught in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, here's where I disagree. It's not exactly the same. And the striking parallels between what Paul said to Corinth and what he said to Rome, it seems very obvious to me, Mr. Martinsick, that both are speaking of the same things. And again, I don't think they're speaking of the same things, but we'll keep reading that later on. But in Rome, Martinsick notices there were more Jews in both, and we have both Jews and Gentiles bringing their baggage and thought patterns into the true faith, both of which were based on traditions and ideas of men. And that sentiment is also shared by myself. In Rome, there do seem to be more Jews, even though many of them were expelled from Rome, perhaps a few years earlier than Paul writing the letter, right, by Emperor Claudius, expelled the Jews from Rome. I think it was in the early 50s, around 52 or 53, something like that. And yet the Jews returned in number from that exile, from that expulsion, and began to form synagogue communities once again. But by this time, when they returned, the Jews returned, it is understandable that the Jews would have been the minorities in the synagogue communities. The Gentiles would have now represented the majority of addressees that Paul was speaking to in this letter. Indeed, I believe that the letter to the book of Rome, the letter of book of Romans, and the addressees of chapter 14 are primarily Gentiles and are primarily Gentile Christians, i.e. the strong that we identify in the letter, which means the minority group would have been either the Jewish Christians and or Jewish non-believers that perhaps were within influence of Paul's letter, and we'll talk about that a little later on. In closing, for Mr. Martinsick, he says the Jews had their fast days, by comparison, the church at Corinth was probably most definitely more Gentiles, former pagans who had converted to Christianity and were finding their way and finding out what it meant to be a covenant member as a Gentile. Although, there were probably some Jewish believers in the congregation as well, but probably not as many, seeing as how Corinth was more of a center of paganism than ancient Rome was at the time. I think it had, that Corinth housed the temple of Aphrodite, I believe it was. Either Athena or Aphrodite. I can't remember one of the two. One of the two female deities that was part of the pagan traditions of that day. So Paul's going to have to work with the heavy paganism in Corinth, whereas he probably didn't have as much blatant paganism in Rome, although we still had emperor worship, we still had the pantheon of gods, but we just didn't have the stronger Greco-paganism as opposed to the Roman paganism in Rome. So Mr. Martinsick says the Jews had their fast days and concerns about otherwise clean meats becoming common, and Gentiles had their tendencies towards idolatry. I think that's a fair assessment about the two groups. Jewish people were concerned about becoming common and unclean with their fast days, their feast days, their festivals, and keeping kosher, whereas Gentiles former pagan Gentiles who were coming now into Christianity and leaving that paganism behind probably didn't have the connection to the kashrut, the dietary issues, the fast days and feast days of the Jews and things like that, clean and unclean meats per se, unless they maybe came from a background to maybe proselyte Judaism, where they were Gentiles who had been proselytized. Mr. Martinsa concludes the stronger believer had fully cleansed their minds of these patterns, right? The patterns of either what he describes as fast days, clean meats, concerns about clean meats common and becoming common in Gentiles, things like, and Gentiles and their tendency toward idol. Either way, the stronger believer was free from either the connection to idolatry and or the connection, if he was maybe a proselyte, the connection supposedly to Jewish fast days, feast days, and dietary issues and things like that. So he labels the strong believer having fully cleansed their mind of these patterns. But they were warned to walk in love regardless, and not to do things that cause weakness in others. And so his commentary is very helpful. I'm not trying to slam it in any way. I'm simply drawing some comparisons and contrasts from it. You can click on the link number 4 in my own Romans commentary here, Romans 14 commentary, and notice that I pulled that information from www.eliah, that's ELIYAH.com, commentary to the book of Romans. And you can go back and read it on your own. You can follow the link straight from my own website if that works for you. All right, so I think what we'll do is we'll stop the Romans commentary at this juncture, and next week we'll start looking at some bullet points where I highlight some of the reasons why I disagree with traditional Christian commentaries that the weak and the strong of Romans 14 are nearly identical in every way to the weak and the strong of the 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 passages. Again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. There are some very strong similarities between the two groups, and this creates similar admonitions from Paul when he's putting together the two letters, and thus that's why we do have some overlap. There is definitely an overlap between the two communities in terms of the overall scope of Paul's admonition to serve one another in love, to not to judge one another, to not to quarrel over differing opinions. And there's definitely an overall general similarity between the two instructions about avoiding idolatry and avoiding things that would cause weaker people, whether they are Jewish brothers, Gentile brothers, or another type of brother, which we haven't discussed yet, weaker people to stumble in their walk of holiness towards God. So that's where the similarities are, but we'll look at some of the differences as well. We'll do that next week as we start looking at these half dozen or so bullet points, okay?